They say blood is thicker than water, but they never tell you what happens when that blood turns to poison. I learned this truth at 73, sitting in my kitchen at 3 in the morning, staring at an empty coffee cup, and wondering how I had become a stranger in my own life. For 47 years, I had been the dutiful wife, the sacrificing mother, the woman who always said yes when everyone else said no. My husband had passed 5 years ago, leaving me with a house too big for one person and children who saw me only as a solution to their problems. I thought his death would mark the beginning of my freedom, but instead, it became the moment my children decided I belonged to them completely. My eldest son had moved back home 6 months after the funeral, not to comfort me as he claimed, but because his third marriage had crumbled and he needed somewhere to land while he sorted out his finances. He was 45 years old, a man who had never learned to cook for himself or do his own laundry. When I suggested he might want to find his own place, he would remind me how lonely I must be, how dangerous it was for an elderly woman to live alone. His concern felt like a cage wrapped in velvet. My daughter visited every Tuesday and Thursday, armed with a list of things I was apparently doing wrong. The way I organized my medications, the food I kept in my refrigerator, the television programs I watched. She spoke to me the way I had once spoken to her when she was 5 years old. Her voice filled with exaggerated patience that barely concealed her irritation. She had become successful in her career as a financial advisor, and she treated my life like another portfolio that needed aggressive management. My youngest son called me every day, but only when he needed something. Money for rent, money for car repairs, money for his children's school fees. His wife had stopped working years ago, claiming she needed to focus on her art, though I had never seen any evidence of artistic endeavors. When I hesitated to write another check, he would remind me of everything he had done for me, though I could never quite remember what those things were. The pattern had been so gradual that I barely noticed it forming. Small requests that grew larger, brief visits that stretched into permanent arrangements, suggestions that hardened into demands. I found myself asking permission to rearrange my own furniture, apologizing for meals they found inadequate, defending my right to choose my own doctor. My house had become their house, my money had become their inheritance, distributed early, and my opinions had become irrelevant noise they tolerated with visible effort. I told myself this was normal. Children needed support sometimes, and I was fortunate to be in a position to provide it. I reminded myself of all the times I had needed help when they were young, all the sacrifices their father and I had made without complaint. This was simply my turn to be needed again, even if the need felt different somehow, more urgent, and less grateful than I remembered. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday. My daughter arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, carrying her usual manila folder of concerns and corrections. She had been particularly focused lately on what she called my spending habits, which apparently included buying name-brand groceries and keeping the thermostat above 65 degrees. She settled at my kitchen table with the air of someone preparing for a long and necessary intervention. She spread out bank statements and bills like evidence in a trial I did not know I was attending. Her voice took on that careful tone she used with difficult clients as she explained how my financial resources needed to be better managed for the future. My future, she clarified, though it sounded like she was planning someone else's life entirely. She had prepared what she called a reasonable budget that would eliminate all unnecessary expenses and redirect the savings toward what she described as more appropriate long-term care options. I listened to her outline restrictions on everything from my grocery shopping to my charitable giving, watching her check items off a list with the satisfaction of someone solving a complex problem. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for my gratitude for her thoughtful management of my affairs. Instead, I asked her a question that surprised us both. "Why do you think you have the right to control my money?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire neither of us had noticed starting. Her expression shifted through several emotions before settling on the patient disappointment I had become accustomed to seeing. She explained, slowly and clearly, that she was not trying to control anything, but simply helping me make better decisions before I became incapable of making any decisions at all. Her words carried the implication that this incapacity was not a matter of if, but when. She reminded me of small things I had forgotten recently, appointments I had mixed up, names I had momentarily lost, normal things, I had thought, the kind of minor lapses that come with age and grief and the simple accumulation of years. But she had been collecting these moments like evidence, building a case for my incompetence that she presented with the confidence of someone who believed she was acting in my best interest. Later that day, after she left with promises to return tomorrow to finalize the new budget arrangements, I sat in my living room and tried to remember the last time one of my children had asked me how I was feeling rather than telling me what I should be doing. The silence stretched back months, maybe years. I realized that, somewhere along the way, I had stopped being a person to them and had become instead a problem to be solved, a responsibility to be managed, a resource to be allocated. That evening, my eldest son returned from whatever he did during the days when he was supposed to be job hunting. He had been drinking, not heavily, but enough that his usual mask of concerned consideration had slipped. He settled into the recliner that had been his father's favorite chair and began complaining about his day, his ex-wife, his financial difficulties, and the unfairness of a world that did not recognize his potential. I had heard this litany countless times, had offered sympathy and advice and financial assistance until the words felt worn smooth from repetition. But that night, something in his tone caught my attention in a new way. He was not sharing his troubles with me seeking comfort or counsel. He was listing his grievances like items on a bill, problems that I was somehow responsible for resolving, simply because I was his mother and I was available. When he finished his recitation, he looked at me with the expectancy of someone waiting for service at a restaurant. I asked him what he thought I should do about his problems, and his answer revealed more than I think he intended. He did not want me to do anything about them, he said. He just wanted me to fix them. The distinction seemed important to him, though I could not understand why. The next morning brought a phone call from my youngest son that followed the familiar script. He needed money for something urgent and unavoidable. Spoke with the rushed urgency of someone accustomed to getting what he requested without much questioning. But this time, instead of reaching for my checkbook, I asked him about his children, my grandchildren, whom I rarely saw despite living in the same city. His pause lasted long enough for me to understand that my question had disrupted his carefully planned conversation. He provided brief, distracted answers before steering back to his financial emergency. But something in that pause made me realize that he knew as little about his children's daily lives as I did. We were both going through motions we had repeated so often that we had forgotten why we were performing them. The following Tuesday, my daughter returned with revised budget documents and what she called a preliminary application for a senior living community that offered excellent care and social opportunities for people in my situation. She had scheduled a tour for the following week. Pending my approval, though she spoke about it as if my approval were a formality rather than a choice. I looked at the glossy brochure while she explained the benefits of structured activities and professional supervision. The facility looked pleasant enough, with well-maintained gardens and smiling elderly residents engaged in various therapeutic crafts. But every image showed people being led rather than leading, participating in activities chosen for them rather than pursuing interests they had selected themselves. When I asked about the cost, she assured me that my current assets would cover several years of care, and by then we could reassess my needs. The pronoun caught my attention. We would reassess my needs. Not I would decide what I wanted, but we would determine what I required. The difference felt as significant as the space between freedom and captivity. That afternoon, I did something I had not done in years. I took a long walk through my neighborhood without telling anyone where I was going. I had forgotten how it felt to move through the world without reporting my intentions or asking permission for my choices. The simple act of walking where I wanted to walk, for as long as I wanted to walk, reminded me of a person I used to be. I stopped at the small coffee shop where my husband and I used to meet friends on Sunday mornings before age and illness reduced our social circle to medical appointments and family obligations. The owner recognized me and asked how I was doing with the genuine interest of someone who remembered me as more than a collection of problems to be managed. As I sat with my coffee, I watched other people living their lives according to their own decisions. A woman about my age was reading a book she had chosen, drinking coffee she had ordered, sitting where she wanted to sit for as long as she wanted to stay. The normalcy of her autonomy struck me as revolutionary. When I returned home, my son was waiting with barely concealed irritation. He had been worried, he said, when he discovered I was not home. What if something had happened? What if I had fallen or gotten lost or forgotten where I lived? His concern felt less like care and more like surveillance, a monitoring system I had not agreed to but had somehow become subject to anyway. I assured him that I was fine, that I had simply gone for a walk and stopped for coffee. His response revealed the depth of his assumptions about my capabilities and rights. He thought I should have left a note, he said. He thought I should carry a cell phone so he could reach me. He thought I should limit my outings to times when someone could accompany me. He thought many things about what I should do, but he had not thought to ask what I wanted. That night, I lay awake thinking about the difference between being cared for and being controlled. The line between them had blurred so gradually that I had not noticed when concern became confinement, when help became hindrance, when love became a kind of suffocation, disguised as devotion. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I called my daughter and canceled the tour of the senior living facility. When she asked why, I told her I was not ready to make that kind of change. When she began to explain why readiness was not really the issue, I interrupted her with words I had not spoken in decades. No, I said. I am not going to tour the facility. I am not going to implement your budget restrictions. And I am not going to continue these conversations about my inadequacies and limitations. I am 73 years old, not dead, and I am capable of making my own decisions about my own life. The silence that followed felt different from the usual pauses in our conversations. This was not the quiet of someone gathering arguments or preparing explanations. This was the silence of someone encountering unexpected resistance from a source they had not imagined could resist. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a tone I had not heard since she was a teenager, testing boundaries she thought were unreasonable. She asked if I was feeling all right, if I had been taking my medications properly, if I had been under stress that might be affecting my judgment. Each question implied that my refusal to accept her management must be a symptom of something wrong with me, rather than something right with my thinking. I told her I was feeling better than I had in years, that my medications were exactly as prescribed by my doctor, not hers, and that the only stress I had been experiencing came from constant questioning of my competence by people who should trust my ability to live my own life. The conversation ended with her promise to call back when I was ready to discuss things rationally, which clearly meant when I was ready to agree with her assessment of my situation. But I found myself hoping that conversation would never happen, that I would never again be ready to surrender my agency to someone else's ideas about what was best for me. Later that day, my youngest son called with his usual request for money, but this time I had a different response. I asked him to tell me about his children, about his wife's art, about his plans for becoming financially independent rather than financially dependent. The questions seemed to confuse him, as if I had started speaking a foreign language in the middle of a familiar conversation. When he deflected back to his immediate need for funds, I told him something I had never said before. I explained that I would be happy to discuss a loan if he could present me with a plan for repaying it and a timeline for achieving financial independence. Otherwise, I would prefer to spend my money on things that brought me joy, rather than enabling patterns that brought him dependency. His shock manifested as anger, a response that revealed how much he had come to depend on my automatic compliance with his requests. He reminded me of everything he had done for me, but when I asked him to be specific, his examples were either things any decent person would do for a family member or things he claimed credit for that I had actually done myself. The conversation ended with him accusing me of selfishness, a charge that might have devastated me months earlier, but now felt like recognition of something I had forgotten how to be. I had been so focused on being selfless that I had become a person without a self, someone whose identity existed only in relation to other people's needs and demands. That evening, I asked my eldest son when he planned to move out. The question seemed to short-circuit his thinking, as if the possibility of leaving had never occurred to him, despite his temporary arrangement having lasted almost 2 years. He began explaining his various complications and setbacks, the reasons why moving out remained impractical despite his best intentions. I listened to his litany of obstacles and excuses until he finished. Then I offered him something he had not expected. I told him I would help him find an apartment and cover his security deposit and first month's rent, but that I needed him to be out of my house within 60 days. The assistance came with a condition. I would not provide ongoing financial support for his living expenses. This would be a one-time gift to help him transition to independence, not the beginning of a new pattern of dependence. His response revealed the depth of his assumptions about my role in his life. He had not been staying with me temporarily while he got back on his feet. He had been staying with me permanently while I supported his unwillingness to get back on his feet. The distinction mattered more than I had realized. The weeks that followed brought a series of conversations that felt like negotiations with emotional terrorists. Each of my children employed different strategies to convince me that my new boundaries were unreasonable, dangerous, or evidence of declining mental capacity. They enlisted relatives and family friends to express concern about my sudden changes in behavior, as if choosing to live my own life were a symptom of illness rather than health. My daughter scheduled an appointment with my doctor without telling me, then arrived at my house, expecting me to accompany her so she could discuss her concerns about my recent decisions with a medical professional. When I refused to go, she accused me of being uncooperative and secretive, as if my medical care were her responsibility rather than mine. My youngest son alternated between pleading and threatening, reminding me of family loyalty when he needed money and family dysfunction when I refused to provide it. His wife called to explain how my selfishness was affecting their children, my grandchildren whose names she had trouble remembering during previous conversations when she was not attempting emotional manipulation. My eldest son simply refused to look for an apartment, as if ignoring my deadline would make it disappear. He continued living in my house as though our conversation had never happened. Leaving his belongings spread throughout rooms I rarely entered anymore, because they no longer felt like mine. The pressure was enormous and constant, a siege of guilt and obligation designed to wear down my resistance until I returned to the familiar patterns of compliance and sacrifice. There were moments when I almost surrendered, when the emotional exhaustion of defending my right to make my own choices felt more difficult than simply giving up that right. But something had changed in me that could not be unchanged. I had remembered what it felt like to want things, to make choices, to live according to my own priorities rather than other people's demands. The memory was too precious to abandon, even when keeping it required more strength than I thought I possessed. 2 weeks before my deadline, I took action that surprised even me. I called a locksmith and had the locks changed on my house. I packed my eldest son's belongings and left them on the front porch with a note explaining that his 60 days had expired and that I would not be providing an extension. When he returned that evening to find himself locked out of what he had begun considering his home, his fury was immediate and absolute. The scene that followed felt like something from a different family, a family where love had been replaced by entitlement and care had been replaced by control. He shouted at me through the locked door, accusing me of cruelty and selfishness and abandonment. Neighbors came out to witness the spectacle of a middle-aged man having a tantrum on his elderly mother's porch because she had refused to house and support him indefinitely. Eventually, he gathered his belongings and left, but not before promising that I would regret my decision when I needed help and had no one to call. The threat was meant to frighten me into changing my mind, but instead it clarified something I had been trying to understand. He had not been staying with me to help me. He had been staying with me to help himself, and his presence had made me feel more alone than I had ever felt living by myself. The next morning, I called my daughter and my youngest son and informed them of the previous evening's events. Their responses were immediate and predictable. They were shocked by my harsh treatment of their brother, concerned about my safety living alone, and united in their conviction that I was making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. I listened to their objections and criticisms until they exhausted their arguments. Then I said something that ended the conversation more effectively than hanging up the phone. I told them that I loved them, that I hoped they could learn to love me as a person rather than a resource, and that I would no longer be available for conversations about how I should live my life differently to make their lives easier. The silence that followed felt like freedom. In the months since I reclaimed my house and my life, my children have made various attempts to reestablish the old patterns of our relationship. They call less frequently, visit even less, and when they do make contact, they seem unsure how to interact with someone who no longer automatically agrees with their assessments and suggestions. My daughter has stopped bringing budget spreadsheets and brochures for senior facilities. Instead, she makes polite conversation about weather and current events, as if I were an acquaintance she occasionally encounters rather than her mother. The superficiality of these interactions saddens me, but it is preferable to the depth of her previous attempts to control my life. My youngest son still calls when he needs money, but now these conversations are brief. When I decline his requests, he no longer argues or pleads or attempts to manipulate. He simply ends the call and disappears for weeks before trying again. I realize now that my value to him was entirely financial, and without my willingness to provide funds, we have little relationship left to maintain. My eldest son moved in with his ex-wife temporarily, then with a series of friends and relatives who gradually grew tired of supporting his unwillingness to support himself. I occasionally hear updates about his situation from people who assume I must be worried about him, but I find myself feeling something closer to relief than concern. His problems are finally his own to solve. The house feels different now, lighter somehow, as if the weight of other people's expectations had been pressing down on everything like a heavy blanket. I have rearranged furniture, changed paint colors, and filled rooms with things I enjoy, rather than things other people thought I should want. The space reflects my preferences now, not compromises designed to accommodate visitors who saw my home as their convenience. I have reconnected with friends I had lost touch with during the years when my children consumed all my emotional energy and most of my time. These relationships feel different from family relationships, based on mutual enjoyment rather than obligation, maintained by choice rather than genetics. People choose to spend time with me because they like my company, not because they need something from me. I have also discovered interests I had forgotten I possessed. I started taking art classes at the community center, something I had wanted to do for years but had never found time for. when my time belonged to other people. I volunteer at the library reading to children, an activity that fills me with the kind of satisfaction I used to get from helping my own children before helping them became indistinguishable from enabling them. Most surprisingly, I have started dating. The idea would have horrified me a year ago, when I still thought of myself as someone whose romantic life had ended with widowhood. But I have rediscovered that I am more than a mother, more than a caretaker, more than a solution to other people's problems. I am a woman with her own desires and interests, and capacity for joy. The man I have been seeing is a widower who understands both loss and renewal. We enjoy each other's company without needing each other's resources. We make plans based on what we want to do rather than what we think we should do. The relationship exists for its own sake, rather than as a means to some other end. My children do not know about this relationship, partly because they rarely ask about my life anymore, and partly because I have learned to protect the things that bring me happiness from people who might try to complicate or control them. Privacy has become a luxury I guard carefully after years of having none. Sometimes I wonder if I waited too long to reclaim my life, if I should have established these boundaries years or even decades earlier, but I try not to dwell on regrets about time that cannot be recovered. Instead, I focus on making the most of the time I have left, living it according to my own values and priorities, rather than other people's expectations and demands. The most unexpected consequence of my transformation has been the response from other people my age. Women I barely knew have approached me to share their own stories of family members who treat them as resources rather than people. They ask how I found the courage to change patterns that had been established for decades, how I withstood the pressure to return to familiar roles of sacrifice and compliance. I tell them what I learned: that being needed is not the same as being valued, that helping is not the same as enabling, and that love that requires you to diminish yourself is not really love at all. These conversations remind me that my experience is not unique, that many women my age have found themselves trapped in relationships where their worth depends entirely on their usefulness to others. Some of these women have made their own changes after hearing about mine. They have established boundaries with adult children who treat them like personal banks or free labor. They have refused to be guilted into arrangements that benefit everyone except themselves. They have remembered that they are complete people with rights and desires that matter as much as anyone else's. Others listen to my story with envy, but insist that their situations are different, more complicated, more impossible to change. They have convinced themselves that their sacrifice is noble rather than self-destructive, that their family members would be lost without their constant support and intervention. I understand their reasoning because I used it myself for so many years. But I also know now that the most loving thing I ever did for my children was to stop rescuing them from the consequences of their own choices. By refusing to solve their problems, I forced them to develop their own problem-solving skills. By refusing to support their dependence, I created space for them to become independent. Whether they will take advantage of that space remains to be seen. My eldest son continues to move from one temporary arrangement to another, apparently learning nothing from his pattern of wearing out welcomes through his refusal to contribute to his own support. My youngest son has found other relatives to approach for money, spreading his financial requests across a wider network, so that no one person bears the full burden of his irresponsibility. My daughter has thrown herself into managing other people's lives with the same intensity she once focused on mine. She has become deeply involved in her in-laws' affairs, offering the same kind of concerned oversight she used to provide for me. I wonder if they appreciate her attention more than I did, or if they simply have not yet reached their own moment of rebellion. I hope that someday we will find a way to have relationships based on affection rather than utility, connection rather than control. But I have accepted that this may not happen, and I have learned to find peace with that possibility. I cannot force them to see me as a person rather than a resource, but I can refuse to play the role they have assigned me. The most profound change in my life has been the discovery that I do not need their approval to be happy. For decades, I measured my worth by their satisfaction with my performance as mother, supporter, and problem solver. Their happiness was my responsibility. Their problems were my failures. Their needs were my commands. Now I understand that each person is responsible for their own happiness, their own problems, their own needs. I can offer support and assistance when I choose to, but I am not obligated to provide it simply because I am biologically related to people who expect it. Family relationships, like all relationships, should be mutually beneficial, rather than one-sided extractions of energy and resources. The woman I am now would be unrecognizable to the woman I was 2 years ago. That woman apologized for taking up space, asked permission for her own preferences, and defined herself entirely through her usefulness to others. She was afraid of being alone because she had no relationship with herself, afraid of being selfish because she had no sense of self to be selfish about. This woman knows her own mind, trusts her own judgment, and enjoys her own company. She makes decisions based on what seems right to her rather than what seems acceptable to others. She has learned the difference between loneliness and solitude, between selfishness and self-respect, between family obligation and family manipulation. If I could speak to my younger self, I would tell her that setting boundaries is not cruel, that saying no is not selfish, and that her value as a person does not depend on her willingness to sacrifice her own needs for other people's wants. I would tell her that the people who truly love her will respect her right to make her own choices, even when those choices inconvenience them. But I could not have heard that message when I was younger. Just as many women my age cannot hear it now. We have been taught that our worth lies in our service to others, that our needs matter less than everyone else's, that our role is to smooth the way for people who would rather be enabled than challenged to grow. Learning to unlearn these lessons has been the hardest and most important work of my life. It required me to disappoint people I love, to withstand criticism from people whose opinions I value, and to risk rejection from people whose acceptance I had always craved. The cost was high, but the alternative was higher. Continuing to live as a shadow of myself until there was nothing left to cast a shadow. Now, as I sit in my kitchen on quiet mornings, drinking coffee I chose from a cup I selected, in a house arranged according to my preferences, I feel something I had forgotten was possible. I feel at home in my own life. The silence is no longer the absence of other people's voices telling me what to do. It is the presence of my own voice, finally free to speak.